Hi, I'm the History Guy. I have a degree in history and I love history, and if you love history too, this is the channel for you. Among the world's elite fighting forces, perhaps none holds more mystique than the famed French Foreign Legion. Immortalized in novelist P.C. Ren's Beau Geste, an adventure novel about life in the Legion that has spawned 4 famous film adaptations, the famed Légion Étrangère is seen as a place where cutthroats and refugees can earn a new life and French citizenship through military service. But the French Foreign Legion was not always the elite force that we know today, and in fact it was nearly disbanded in the 19th century when one battle changed everything and established a reputation and a legend that is still revered today. The story of the famous piece of wood that is the heart of one of the world's most elite fighting forces is little known outside of France, but the epic tale of Jean d'Anjou and the Battle of Cameron is a tale of extraordinary bravery in the face of overwhelming odds, and it deserves to be remembered. In 1830, Charles X, the last of the French monarchs of the House of Bourbon, was forced to abdicate after what was called the July Revolution, and was replaced by his cousin, Louis-Philippe, the Duke of Orleans. One of the results of the revolution was that France saw an influx of immigrants. Some of those were idealists coming to France because they shared the liberal ideas of the French Revolution, and others were former soldiers of Napoleon. In 1831, King Louis-Philippe decreed the formation of the French Foreign Legion to be made up of foreign volunteers. The creation of the force served 2 purposes. First, it helped to remove the domestic threat of immigrants who could be disruptive to the government. And second, it provided additional military support for French colonial endeavors, especially the French conquest of Algeria, which had become bogged down and was becoming increasingly unpopular at home. As the goal was to remove disruptive elements, the Legion allowed men to join anonymously, and any information offered was taken at face value. That provision ended up allowing French citizens, technically ineligible for the Legion, to join. They were mostly petty criminals or men running from their past. As you can imagine, a force made up of foreigners and petty criminals that by law was not allowed to operate inside of metropolitan France was not particularly attractive to regular officers and not highly regarded by the regular army. The early Legion was rife with discipline issues, desertion, and suffered from a lack of good officers and non-commissioned officers. The Legion was used for undesirable deployments, for example supporting the Regency against the Carlists in the Spanish Civil War in 1833, a war in which the Legion was almost completely decimated by lengthy combat operations and almost complete lack of support from both France and Spain. Ironically, it was the Carlist defeat that reinvigorated the Legion, as many former Spanish rebels fled to France and into the French Foreign Legion. The headquarters was in Algeria, where the fighting continued until 1847. In 1848, Louis-Philippe was overthrown and replaced by the first popularly elected French head of state, Louis Napoleon, the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte. Louis Napoleon was a reformer at home, but also known for military adventurism abroad. Over the next decade, the Legion was sent on more undesirable foreign deployments, including the cholera-stricken war in the Crimea and the bloody Second Italian War of Independence. Even though they proved themselves in combat many times and had been expanded into a larger force, they were still poorly regarded within the French military. In 1861, Louis Napoleon invaded Mexico in the War of the French Intervention. Ostensibly fought over Mexican war debts and free trade, the war was actually a last attempt at European domination of Mexico, with Louis Napoleon's aim to install a European monarch who could lead a reliable Catholic counterbalance to the United States. The Legion was sent to join the war in Mexico in March of 1863. Among the legionnaires was Captain Jean d'Anjou. D'Anjou had attended a prestigious military academy and joined the French army in 1848. In 1852, he had transferred to the Foreign Legion, where he was a veteran of the wars in Algeria, the Crimea, Morocco, and Sardinia. In 1853, he had lost his left hand when his musket exploded, and he had had a wooden prosthetic made. In Mexico, he was a member of the headquarters staff of Colonel Pierre Jean Ingros, the commander of the Foreign Legion in Mexico. In Mexico, the Legion had characteristically been given the worst duty assignments, protecting supply convoys that came up the coast. The commander of the French forces in Mexico, General Frederick Foray, said, "I prefer to leave the foreigners, rather than Frenchmen, to guard the most unhealthy area, where malaria reigned." The Legion was assigned to man local guard posts, and tropical diseases like malaria and yellow fever decimated their ranks. In 1862, the French had tried to take the Mexican fortress in the city of Puebla by assault. They had been defeated with heavy losses in a battle that demonstrated that the war would not be easily won. The Mexican victory at the Battle of Puebla, May 5th of 1862, is still celebrated today as Cinco de Mayo. As a response, in 1863, the French had laid siege to the fortress, a key strongpoint blocking the French forces from taking the capital in Mexico City. But the siege had bogged down in the face of fierce Mexican resistance. General Foray had sent to have a supply train brought up with huge siege cannons and the army's pay, nearly 4 million francs, from the port at Vera Cruz. That convoy would obviously be the target of Mexican guerrillas, and the responsibility for protecting the convoy fell to the French Foreign Legion. The convoy was being escorted by 2 companies of the Legion. On April 29th, a spy informed Colonel Jean that a substantial Mexican force had been dispatched to attack the convoy. The colonel decided to send another company on a patrol to reinforce the convoy. The company chosen, the 3rd Company of the 1st Battalion, had a nominal strength of 120, but due to illness had only 62 legionnaires fit for duty. As all the company officers were disabled due to illness, Captain Danjou volunteered to lead the patrol, accompanied by 2 lieutenants from the headquarters company. The company left at 1 a.m. the morning of April 30th, preferring to march at night to avoid the heat of the day. By 7 a.m. they had arrived at the village of Palo Verde, the extent of their patrol, without encountering any enemy. Tired from their march, they paused for breakfast. Around 8 a.m. the sentry spied a dust cloud that indicated a cavalry formation. The small patrol of just 60 men had just run into approximately 600 Mexican cavalry. Danjou tried to lead his group back to an abandoned walled hacienda called Cameron, about a half-mile away, but the cavalry caught them before they could get to the safety of the buildings. Caught in the open by 10 times their number in cavalry, Danjou ordered the legionnaires to form a square, a tight formation with 2 ranks, one standing and one kneeling. The cavalry charged. At 50 meters, Danjou gave the order to fire, killing many of the cavalrymen and blunting their attack. Knowing they could not defend themselves in the open, Danjou ordered the company to make for the hacienda. They fixed bayonets and charged. Several of the company were killed or captured in the running fight to the walls, but Danjou and 46 legionnaires made it to the hacienda, now defending little more than a farmhouse courtyard made of stone walls. A Mexican officer came to Danjou under a white flag and offered the opportunity to surrender. Danjou refused, saying that his men had plenty of ammunition and would fight. Danjou went to each of his men, asking them to pledge to die rather than be captured. Without hope of holding out until rescue, Danjou intended to distract as many enemy as he could from attacking the convoy. The Mexican army threw wave after wave of attack against the hacienda, but the legionnaires defended the walls fiercely. The supply mules had been lost at the start of the battle, and they had little water or food in the oppressive heat. Around noon, Captain Danjou was struck in the chest by a Mexican bullet. He died a few minutes later. 2 battalions of Mexican infantry arrived, bringing the Mexican force up to nearly 2,000. The Mexicans continued to press the attack, trying to hack holes in the walls. By 6 p.m., only Lieutenant Modet and 4 legionnaires remained, and they were down to their last bullets. They fired and charged with their bayonets. A Mexican volley killed 1 legionnaire and wounded Lieutenant Modet. Surrounded, a Mexican colonel demanded that the last 3 legionnaires surrendered. They replied, only if they were allowed to keep their arms and that their wounded be treated. Astounded by their bravery, the colonel agreed, saying, "One refuses nothing to men such as you." It is a peculiarity of war that soldiers who are willing to fight their enemy to the death still respect that enemy in battle. There was no just cause for the War of the French Intervention. These legionnaires were invaders, and yet the Mexican army respected their brave last stand. When presented with the last 3 legionnaires from the battle, the Mexican commander, Colonel Francisco Milan, said in amazement, "These are not men, they are demons." In the nearly 10-hour battle, the 62 men of the 3rd Company had caused nearly 600 Mexican casualties, killed or wounded. True to their word, the Mexicans treated the French wounded, although Lieutenant Modet did die later of his wounds. In all, 24 members of the 3rd Company survived the battle, virtually all of those wounded, and most returned to France in July of that year in a prisoner exchange. Alerted to Milan's presence, the convoy stopped until they could reinforce their guard and did eventually reach their destination. The Mexicans who were besieged in the Battle of Puebla surrendered in May of 1863, but the war raged on for another 3 years before, faced with increasing unpopularity with the war at home and pressure from the United States, Louis Napoleon was compelled to withdraw Mexican forces in 1866. Maximilian's remaining forces were defeated in 1867, and Maximilian himself was captured and executed in May of 1867, ending the war. The Battle of Cameron is seen as a defining moment in the history of the French Foreign Legion. It is considered the event that earned them a permanent and respected place in the French military. Legionnaires served with great distinction in both world wars, suffered greatly in the defeat at Dien Bien Phu in the First Indochina War, and continue to serve today in the global war on terror. The French Foreign Legion, which is still the only unit of the French military that accepts foreign recruits, is today numbered among the world's most elite fighting forces. Jean d'Anjou's hand was recovered by a local farmer and reacquired by the Legion. Some stories say it was recovered by a Belgian ally, and some say that a former legionnaire bought it from the farmer. It is kept at the Legion headquarters in Aubagne, France, and taken out for a parade every April 30th, Cameron Day. His hand is the most cherished artifact of the Legion. It represents not just a brave battle, but a defining moment where the legend of the French Foreign Legion was born. It is a link between the Legion of today and its storied past. It deserves to be remembered. On September 12, 1897, 21 soldiers of the Sikh Regiment of the British Indian Army were attacked in a small mountain fort by more than 10,000 Afghan tribesmen. The nearly forgotten Battle of Saragarhi along the famed Khyber Pass is one of the greatest last stands in history, and it deserves to be remembered. The history of the British Empire along what was called the Northwest Frontier on the northwest side of British India was long and frequently bloody. British officers who fought there in the 19th and 20th centuries referred to it as the Grim. British interest in Afghanistan began as early as the 18th century, and Afghanistan became a centerpiece in what was called the Great Game, which was a political and military contest between the British Empire and the Russian Empire for influence in Central Asia. Between 1849 and 1947, the British fought 3 wars with the Afghanis, and there were numerous other small conflicts and punitive expeditions. And a lot of that had to do with the disputed lands between the frontier of British India in what is now modern-day Pakistan and Afghanistan. This high mountain region was inhabited by tribes of the Pashtun people. Pashtuns are fiercely independent, militaristic Islamic people who would sometimes ally with the British and sometimes go to war with them. The famed Khyber Pass is the high mountain pass through this region. After a tribal uprising and punitive expedition in 1891, the British decided that they should fortify and garrison the Khyber Pass. They built 2 chief fortifications, Fort Gulistan, which was on the western end of the pass, and Fort Lockhart, which was in the center of the pass. The 2 forts were just 3 miles apart, but they couldn't see each other because in between was a tall mountain. And so the British built a small signaling post on top of that mountain so that would facilitate communication between the 2 forts, usually using a system of flashing mirrors that was called heliography. That small fortification on top of the mountain was called Fort Saragarhi. In 1897, these fortifications were garrisoned by 5 companies of the 36th Sikh Regiment of the British Indian Army. Sikhs are followers of a pantheistic religion called Sikhism, and they're concentrated in the Punjab region of India, and the Sikh regiments were recruited from among this population. They were known to be fierce warriors. In August of 1897, there was a general uprising of the Pashtun tribes in the area, and Forts Gulistan and Lockhart came under the attack of more than 10,000 Afghan tribesmen. At that time, the forts in the area were garrisoned by just around 500 members of the 36th Sikhs. The forts came under sporadic fire, but there wasn't an all-out attack until mid-September, and because the 2 forts could reinforce each other, the Afghans were unable to get to the fortifications. And so, on September 12th, they decided to focus their attention on Fort Saragarhi, manned by just 21 soldiers, 1 sergeant and 20 troopers from the 36th Sikhs, in hopes of cutting off communication between the 2 forts. The attack could be viewed from Fort Lockhart, and they counted 7 different banners among the Afghan tribes, which allowed them to estimate how many Afghans were attacking Fort Saragarhi, somewhere between 10 and 12,000. Because the ground between them was open, there was little that the garrisons in Fort Gulistan or Fort Lockhart could do to help the soldiers on Saragarhi, because any reinforcements would have to fight their way through the 10,000 Afghanis. But there were reinforcements coming from farther down the pass, and so the 21 troopers decided that instead of trying to escape or surrendering, that they would fight and hold out as long as they could, fight to the last in order to give the most time for those reinforcements to come, even though they knew that that decision was suicide. Now, because it was a signaling post, they were able to use their heliograph to inform the troops at Fort Lockhart of the details of the battle. The attack commenced around 9 a.m. The fort was only stone and mud, but it was tall and it was on top of a mountain, so the Afghanis could not bring their numbers to bear, and the defenders who could concentrate their fire were able to repulse several attacks, but they were slowly being reduced by casualties and they were running out of ammunition. After two determined attempts to force the door were repulsed, the Afghanis finally became frustrated and set fire to the brush in the area, and they were able to move under the cover of the smoke to one of the walls that couldn't be observed and undermine the wall, creating a breach. They stormed in and it became bloody hand-to-hand fighting to the end. The last defender left was the one who had been running the heliograph, and since he was up on a tower, he could observe what was going on down below. And from Fort Lockhart, they could see him shooting into the Afghanis. They assumed he killed as many as 20 before the frustrated Afghanis just set fire to the tower and let him die in the flames. By then, it was after 3 p.m., and the defenders of Saragarhi had held out for more than 6 hours, and that gave the reinforcements much time to come. By the time that the Afghanis could turn their attention back to Fort Gulistan, it was able to hold out until reinforcements arrived. When those reinforcements got to the ruins of Fort Saragarhi, they found more than 600 dead Afghan tribesmen around the fort. The reinforcements were able to drive off the attack with artillery and save the forts. The British responded with a huge punitive expedition that involved more than 30,000 troops. It was called the Tira campaign, and it was a very bloody campaign with lots of casualties on both sides. But eventually the British stomped around the valley, burning all the villages and destroying all the fortifications until the tribes were forced to sue for peace. It was just another inning in the great game. But the brave defense of Saragarhi was told around the world and all the way to the Queen, and all 21 defenders of Fort Saragarhi were awarded the Indian Order of Merit, which was the highest award for Indian troops in the British Indian Army, the equivalent of a Victoria Cross. The battle is still remembered every year on the 12th of September as Saragarhi Day among Sikh units of the Indian Army, but it is largely forgotten everywhere else. And of course that is a tragedy, because the heroic defense of Fort Saragarhi deserves to be remembered. It's understandable that people tend to focus on the history that most matches their experience, and yet it still surprises me how much we here in the West tend to focus on the American and British experience in the Second World War, and how little we seem to understand about the war in the East. But to give an idea of the contrast between the two, to the end of 1944, nearly 8 times as many German soldiers had been killed on the Eastern Front as had been killed on the Western Front. The Western Allies, excluding China, suffered about 1.2 million military casualties during the Second World War. The Soviet Union suffered between 8 and 12 million military casualties during the Second World War. In June, we in America tend to focus on the anniversary June 6th, the anniversary of D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in history. But we talk much less about another anniversary, June 22nd, the anniversary of the largest invasion of any kind in human history. The defense of Brest Fortress on the opening days of Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941, is history that deserves to be remembered. Historians have ascribed many reasons for Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union in 1941. Those can be a matter of dispute, but most frankly conclude that conflict between the two was inevitable. Hitler seems to have come to that conclusion by at least the middle of 1940, when General Erich Marx was tasked with developing a plan for the invasion of the Soviet Union, officially called Operation Draft East, but more commonly called the Marx Plan. The Marx Plan advocated for the occupation of what it called the AA Line. That is the occupation of a line going from the city of Arkhangelsk on the White Sea in northern Russia to the city of Astrakhan on the Caspian Sea. The line was thought to be defensible and would so deprive the Soviet Union of resources that they would cease to be a military threat. The plan suggested that the line could be reached in a quick military campaign that would be achieved before winter set in. That confidence was likely derived from poor assessments of Soviet military readiness based on the loss of officers in Stalin's purges, and what was seen to be a poor performance by the Soviets against Finland in the Winter War in 1939 and 40. The rapid German victory over France in 1940 further bolstered German confidence. Hitler decided to name the operationalization of the Marx Plan Operation Barbarossa after 12th century Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. The plan was so confident that it didn't even include the distribution of winter gear or the winterization of vehicles, because it assumed that all the objectives would be met before the advent of winter. The attack was originally planned to occur May 15, 1941. The sheer scale of the invasion was nearly beyond comprehension. Some 180 Axis divisions, including over 6,000 armored vehicles, nearly 1 million horses, and 65% of the German Air Force, approximately 3.8 million personnel, were scheduled to attack along a front nearly 2,000 miles long. But the army that they were facing was also massive. In June of 1941, the Soviet Union had nearly 6 million troops under arms and were mobilizing a reserve of some 14 million. They had more than 25,000 tanks, 100,000 pieces of artillery, and 18,000 warplanes, the largest air force in the world. It is often asserted that the Red Army was unprepared for the German attack, despite warnings from British, American, and even Stalin's own intelligence sources. That is only partially true. The Soviet Union had undertaken both a defense plan and a mobilization plan. But Stalin seems to have been convinced that Hitler would not attack only 2 years after having signed a non-aggression pact, and Soviet forces were still preparing when the attack first came. They faced many obstacles of organization and supply, lacked adequate transport, and while they had some of the most advanced armor in the world at the time, most of their armored forces were outdated, poorly supplied and equipped, and their crews poorly trained. And while the Red Army was slowly preparing for the eventuality of German attack that they thought likely, Stalin was not keen to provoke Hitler. Records from Soviet archives indicate that the Soviet High Command underestimated the German threat and ignored information about the upcoming invasion. While they were strengthening their border at the time, they were reticent to bring their troops to full combat readiness for fear that that would provoke the Germans into an attack that, it turns out, was already imminent. The date of the attack was moved from May to June. There is some debate why the attack was delayed, maybe because a coup in Yugoslavia had necessitated a German intervention, or maybe because an unusually wet winter meant that rivers were still swollen in May. But the attack commenced at 3:15 a.m. on June 22nd, without a formal declaration of war. Reich Minister of Propaganda Joseph Goebbels announced the attack to the German people on the radio, portraying it as a European crusade against Bolshevism. The Axis attack was divided roughly into 3 commands: Army Groups North, Center, and South. Army Group Center's initial strategic goal was to defeat the Soviet armies in Belarus, between Lithuania and Latvia in the north, and the Ukraine to the south, and occupy the city of Smolensk along the Dnieper River. The ancient city of Brest lies at the border between Poland and Belarus, at the confluence of the Mukievets River into the Bulk River. The confluence of rivers was a strategic point, and fortifications had been built there as early as the 10th century. Between 1830 and 1842, the former medieval castle was replaced by a modern fortification, covering an area of nearly 4 square kilometers. Brest Fortress was part of the fortress strategy of Tsar Nicholas II and was intended to protect the western periphery of the Russian Empire. It was an impressive fortification with a central citadel linked to outlying fortifications built on artificial islands. The walls of the citadel were some 2 meters thick. The fortress had put up a brief but stout defense during the German invasion of Poland in 1939. Having captured the fortress and city, the Germans then handed over the city to the Soviets under the terms of the 1939 Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the secret pact that had defined the boundaries of Soviet and German spheres of influence as part of the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. The German and Soviet armies had held a military parade celebrating the turnover on September 22, 1939. 21 months later, the Germans had decided to throw away that pact and now had to retake the fortress, which was on the front line on the very first day of the invasion. On June 22, 1941, Brest Fortress was garrisoned by about 9,000 Soviet troops, mostly from rifle brigades but also from border forces and artillery. In addition, about 300 civilian family members of the garrison were also inside the fortress. For the Germans, the task of taking the fortress was assigned to the 17,000-strong 45th Infantry Division, which also had significant artillery and armored support. At first, Barbarossa struck like lightning. Within the first few hours of the attack, Soviet command and control were destroyed across the front, paralyzing command and preventing organized defense. Soviet air defense units had been operating under orders not to attack German planes for fear of provoking the Germans. In the initial confusion, as many as 2,000 Soviet aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Communications were disrupted and supply depots were destroyed. Brest Fortress was the tip of the attack, described by some as the site of the first major battle of the campaign. There was an initial 29-minute artillery barrage, including the terrifying German Nebelwerfer rockets on the unprepared fortress. German troops crossed the Bach under the cover of the barrage, surprising the defenders, who were unable to mount an organized defense. The fortress was encircled by 9 a.m. But while the first phase of Operation Barbarossa moved quickly, and Army Group Center bypassed Brest Fortress and sped towards the city of Minsk, encircling and destroying entire Soviet army groups, The beleaguered defenders of Brest Fortress defended strongpoints. Caught by surprise, with many of their officers killed or wounded, outnumbered, short of supplies, and cut off from the outside world, they held their ground. German assaults were repulsed, and attempts to take the fortress stalled. Positions were only taken after fierce fighting, and often resistance only stopped when a building was completely leveled to the ground. The civilians carried supplies, scouted enemy movements, and even took up arms. On the 26th, some of the defenders tried to break out, but were unsuccessful. Unable to break defenders in the eastern fort, the Germans finally had their air force bomb it to rubble. The commander of the 45th Division did not declare the fortress captured until June 30th, a stunning defense given the odds. Yet isolated defenders kept fighting, with some holding on possibly as late as July 23rd, although there's little record of that defense. Graffiti found inside the fortress read, "We'll die, but we'll not leave the fortress." In the end, Soviet casualties in the defense of Brest Fortress were about 6,800 captured and 2,000 killed. German casualties were 429 killed and 668 wounded. And if that doesn't sound like a large number, it's really a huge number. It represents nearly 5% of the total German casualties on the Eastern Front in June of 1941. At a time of almost universally disastrous news for the Soviet Union, the defense of Brest Fortress represented a heroic stand at a point when the rest of the front was in near total collapse. But strategically, the battle was of little importance. The crossroads of the city of Brest were captured by the German army on the very first day. The defense of Brest Fortress is interesting in that it was literally forgotten history for a period of time. Because the fortress was cut off from outside communication, the Soviets didn't even know that the battle had been fought until they captured some of the records of the German 45th Infantry Division in March of 1942. And the defense of Brest Castle wasn't widely publicized in the Soviet Union until the mid-1950s. A museum at the fortress was opened in 1956, and an investigative report on the surviving defenders published in 1957. It then became a point of pride and of Soviet propaganda, stressing fraternity between the people of Russia and Belarus. The propaganda at times has overstated the defense, including a narrative that the fortress held out for 32 days, while in fact organized defense lasted 9 days. The fortress was designated a hero fortress in 1965, and the Memorial Heroic Brest Fortress Complex was opened in 1971. Despite its initial success, Operation Barbarossa eventually collapsed in the battle for Moscow. Today it is considered by many to be amongst the worst military blunders in history and the key cause of the final defeat of Nazi Germany. The so-called Eastern Front was one of the bloodiest, most brutal conflicts in human history and was characterized by things like war crimes, mistreatment of the civilian population, brutal treatment of prisoners of war. Cost the lives of nearly 26 million Soviet citizens. The museum at Brest is still very popular, and the defense of Brest Fortress is well known in Belarus and Russia, but still nearly forgotten here in the West. The defenders of Brest Fortress, cut off, outnumbered, and outgunned, are a symbol of the determination of the Soviet people in what the Russians call the Great Patriotic War. It is history that deserves to be remembered. I'm the History Guy, and I hope you enjoyed this edition of my series of short snippets of forgotten history about 10 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button, which is there on your left. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. And if you'd like more snippets of forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.